when you're ready, you're good to go.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to start with the second half. What Libby just talked about is really this overarching framework about adaptive intervention, right? She was giving us the big picture of what is adaptive intervention, why it matters, like why do we want to have adaptive interventions, and also like how do we use experimental tools to inform adaptive interventions. Now I'm going to like translate all these concepts into a dynamic mobile context and talk about how adaptive interventions are implemented using digital devices such as smartphones and smartwatches. So some of the concept would be overlapping with what Libby talked about. That is intentional. It is supposed to be because just-in-time adaptive intervention is a version or a variant of adaptive intervention. So before I start the technical content, I want to start with like a story, like a fictional figure. Let's think about someone called Miss S. So Miss S is trying to quit smoking, right? So she wants to, well, not quit smoking, cut down with her drinking. Like she has this clear long-term goal of reducing her drinking because drinking is influencing their health and her relationship. But then every day brings obstacles that make this long-term goal difficult to follow through. Like when she's out with her friends, it's very hard to resist the drink. And then when she's coming out of work after a stressful day, drinking feels like the very natural and easiest way to relax. And when she's laying on the couch watching a movie, grabbing a drink almost feels automatic. So Miss S always realized that she made the wrong decision after the moment has passed. And then this goal of drinking less just keep getting pushed to the next day. So what Miss S needs is support that can help her navigate everyday situations right at the moment when she is the most vulnerable, when it's hardest to resist drinking. So this is exactly the kind of challenge that just-in-time adaptive intervention is meant to address. So in this talk, the goal is to give an intuitive understanding of what is a JEDI, and then how it differed from a standard adaptive intervention, and what are the key components of JEDI. We will also talk about the relationship between JEDIs and MRTs. It's like when Libby was emphasizing that an intervention design is different from an experimental design, I will also make the same emphasis that JEDI is an intervention design and MRT is an experimental design. So how do we use the experimental design to inform an intervention? And then we'll get a little bit more statistical and talk about how do we do MRT analysis, like how the estimate is defined, what is the typical data structure of MRT data, and how do we use R code to analyze MRT data. We probably do not have time to cover the sample size, but I did link up all the resources there. So if you ever need to do a sample size calculation on MRT analysis, those are very user-friendly and intuitive resources. So what is a JEDI? Just-in-time adaptive interventions are interventions that use dynamically changing information about a person's state and context to recommend whether and how to deliver an intervention in real time in daily life. So this definition actually carries a lot of meanings. Let's unpack that. So how does a JEDI differ from like a standard adaptive intervention, right? It differs in 3 ways. First, the decisions of whether or not to intervene are made using dynamic information about the person. So a JEDI, in a JEDI, we would consider like, is this person currently stressed in the moment? Where is this person's location? Is this person inside a grocery store where it's possible to buy alcohol? And also, is this person in a social settings where drinking is likely to occur? So this type of use of information is different from the standard classic adaptive interventions, where we use a construct that takes longer to unfold. Like we need a certain amount of time to know whether a medication has worked for someone, right? So that's a very different way of using information. Another way that Jedi differ from standard adaptive intervention is that the adaptation of interventions are made on a relatively fast timescale. So the adaptation can occur every few minutes, every few hours. This is again very different from the standard adaptive interventions, where we probably make adaptations only once or sometimes twice, but we don't make adaptations like many, many times. So I think it's important to clarify that we're not saying that the intervention itself is being delivered very frequently. We're not saying that we are texting people every minute, reminding them to do something. It's just that these decisions about whether or not to intervene is made on a very fast time scale. So a third difference is that Jedis are typically employed outside of standard treatment settings in real time in daily life. So if we go back to think about the example of Miss S, the purpose of this Jedi is to support the person wherever she is. Like whether she's out with friends, whether she's at home watching a movie, whether she is coming out of a stressful conversation. Like we want this Jedi to catch this person right at the moment when the person needed the most. So for this reason, digital devices are often the vehicle of Jedis. It's because like we carry digital devices with us everywhere. So it is the digital devices that can help us to catch all these moments as they unfold in daily lives. Let's make this concrete with an example, right? And think about a Jedi that is designed to help someone reduce their drinking. Again, let's think about Miss S. Throughout the evening, she encounters moments that makes her feel stressed. And these are the moments where she has an urge to drink. Now let's imagine that she's wearing a smartwatch that is monitoring the physiological signals that can let us predict whether Miss S is currently under stress. So the device continuously tracks these signals. And if it detects stress, a message is sent to her smartphone reminding her to do a self-regulatory exercise. This exercise can be taking a deep breath, going out for a walk, drinking a glass of water, doing meditation, etc. But if it doesn't detect stress, then no prompt is sent. So the purpose of this is that we want to use this self-regulation to really break this link between having a stressful moment and this desire to drink and a subsequent drinking. So here is a figure that shows how this Jedi is protocolized on a specific day. At every minute, the system makes a decision about whether or not to send a prompt. Minute 1, it decides, okay, is it stress or not? If stress, prompt. If stress, no prompt. So most of this minute, say like the vast majority of this minute, the decision is no prompt. But then you can imagine that there are very certain specific minutes where the system does detect stress. And those are the moments that triggers sending a message to the person. So let's use these examples, right, to revisit the key features of Jedis. This intervention is adaptive because it uses real-time dynamic information to determine whether or not to intervene. So here, the dynamic information is the person's stress level. Stress level is dynamically changing over minutes. So these decisions are made on a very fast time scale. And then in fact, right, the decision is made every minute. So why is it necessary? Why are we doing that? There are two underlying assumptions that goes into why a Jedi is designed like this. The first assumption is that stress levels is something that can change very quickly. It can change from minutes to minutes. So that is really like very important fundamental assumptions that justifies why are we monitoring stress so closely, and then why are we trying to make a decision on that so quickly? Another assumption is that this intervention itself, in this example, sending a prompt, has an effect that acts quickly, but also dissipates very quickly. So we would assume that by sending person a message, this message may nudge the person to do a self-regulatory activities right away. But we don't assume that this message would continue to be useful after 2 hours or 3 hours. Because like this is why we want to like keep monitoring and then like keep deciding whether to send this person a message, right? So basically both the problem and the solutions are operating on a very fast time scale. Now with that example, so I want to walk through the key components of JEDIs. The first component of a JEDI, this is something that every JEDI should have, this is the building blocks of JEDI, is intervention options. So intervention options are essentially the different actions that we are considering taking at every specific moment. They are interventions that are of different types, different intensities, different tactics, and different delivery modalities. So sometimes we're deciding between two active intervention options. Are we sending this message or are we sending that message? But sometimes we are deciding yes or no. Are we sending a message or are we not sending a message, right? So these are all considered different alternative actions. So they're all different intervention options. Now, in the example we just saw, the two intervention options are straightforward. It's either prompt or no prompt. Tailoring variable is another component. Tailoring variable is the information used to determine which intervention option to offer. In this example, the tailoring variable is stress. Again, referring back to what Libby was talking about, part of what it means to use a tailoring variable is that we need to know what is the threshold of this tailoring variable. Like, what does it mean to be stressed and what does it mean to be not stressed? If we are using a Fitbit, a smartwatch to monitor a person's physiological signals, it's non-trivial to decide like how do we translate these physiological signals to the construct stress. But even if we're asking people to self-report stress, it is still non-trivial because what we want to know is that where is the cutoff point? Like, is it like 3? Is it 4 on the Likert scale? Where is the cutoff point when we make the decision is most likely to impact this person? If we put these two components together, if we combine the intervention options and tailoring variables, we get decision rules. Decision rules are the set of if-then statement that connects intervention options and tailoring variables. So they're telling us that how do we use tailoring variables, which is the if, to decide how to deliver intervention options, which is the then. So the last key component of a JEDI is simply decision point. So these are the time points where an intervention option is selected based on the available information from the person. Now, in this example, we have so many decision points. We have one decision point each minute. So even in a day, we have like over 1,000 decision points. So what's the goal of JEDIs? JEDI are designed to influence the proximal outcome to achieve a distal outcome. Now, distal outcome is the ultimate long-term goal of this intervention. If we think of Miss S, the distal outcome is probably to reduce drinking by the end of the month. Like that is ultimately when we give people an app, that's what we hope this person can achieve. Now, proximal outcome is the short-term behavior or experience that each intervention is intended to impact. So this is a construct that is laying on the causal pathway between the intervention and the distal outcome. So proximal outcome can either be an earlier measure of the distal outcome. So if the distal outcome is reduced drinking, we can say that the proximal outcome is not exceeding 1 drink today. But the proximal outcome can also be a very different construct, such as engagement. Like, is this person engaging in the activities that we are recommending? So I'm putting this picture here. These two pictures are supposed to be examples of self-regulatory activities. The assumption is that for the Jedi to be effective, this prompt that we send, that we recommend people to do as self-regulatory activities, needs to be useful to change people's behavior regarding their self-regulation. It needs to be able to nudge people into doing these self-regulatory activities. And then this self-regulation is in turn protective against having individual drinking episode. Now, by accumulating these small changes, eventually we achieve the ultimate distal outcome. Now, even in these very simple, intuitive examples, there are actually a lot of scientific knowledge that's already baked in this simple example, right? We need to know that the prompt can actually increase people's self-regulation. Like when we ask people to take a walk, we need to know that, okay, this person actually went out to take a walk. And we also need to know that self-regulation is something that is protective against the drinking episode. Like this thing that we're recommending is something that is useful. We also need to know that stress level is a construct that changes from minutes to minutes. That's how we justified why we're monitoring people so closely. We also need to know that to justify these decisions of prompting people when they're stressed, like we need to know that stress is actually an indicator of vulnerability. Like people are likely to drink at the moments when they're feeling stressed. Because maybe that's not true. Maybe people want to drink at the minutes they're very happy. That's also possible. Like we need to know that stress is actually the moments that we want to capture. And another thing that is not obvious is that we also need to know stress does not prevent receptivity. And this is something not very obvious. Like it's possible that when people are feeling stressed, they are not receptive to whatever recommendation we're giving them because they're completely overwhelmed and then they're zoomed out, they're not looking at their phone. We need to know that like stress is not blocking receptivity. Now, finally, like I mentioned, we need to know what is the threshold and then what is the level. Like how does it mean that someone is stressed? Right? How do we detect, how do we distinguish a stressful moment from a non-stressful moment? So a surprising amount of scientific information needs to be in place before we can design a Jedi well. Well, you can imagine that in many real situations, some of this knowledge is missing. We may not know whether a prompt will actually nudge people into doing self-regulatory activities, right? Or whether stressful moments are actually the right moment to try to intervene. And this is exactly where micro-randomized trial come in. When we don't yet have the information, have the evidence to build a Jedi's. So this is the time we use micro-randomized trials to help us generate that type of evidence. So with that, I'm moving to the second part of this talk, which is talking about micro-randomized trials. So to talk about micro-randomized trials, now I want you to imagine a group of scientists who wants to design a Jedi to help people like Miss S. So previously, the entire conversation is really focused on like what kind of help we want to give people. But now we're like really switching the perspective. Like we're becoming the scientists here. Like now we're asking questions. So the scientists may have the general idea that assembling a mobile app that sends people message at the right moment can help them reduce drinking. But all these ideas remains quite hypothetical. Like we may not know whether this particular message that we send in this particular settings can help this particular problem. And then we certainly don't know like whom and when the message worked the best. So to gather the information needed to build a Jedi effectively and also responsibly, the scientists, they decided to conduct a micro-randomized trial, MRT. So what is an MRT? MRT are an optimization trial design. So I want to put the emphasis here on optimization because the purpose of an MRT is not to evaluate whether this Jedi as a whole package is effective or not. So the purpose of this MRT is really trying to look under the hood, look into these Jedis to figure out to generate the evidence that is needed for building this Jedi and for optimizing this Jedi. And MRT employs rapid sequential randomizations to different intervention options. Rapid means that the randomizations are being conducted on a very fast time scale. Like the randomization can be conducted every day or every few hours. So this is very different from a standard trial design where we actually only randomize the participants once or twice. And sequential means that the same person can be randomized many times during the study design. So the person really have exposures to different type of intervention options. Here's to reiterate what is the goal of MRTs. So MRTs are designed to inform the construction of Jedis. If we think of Jedis as a set of protocolized decision rules, they consist of a set of if-then statements. That MRTs are the experimental tools that scientists use to generate these if-then statements. It's the tool that we use to generate the decision rules. So what are some of the typical optimization questions that can be answered by MRTs? So one question we can ask is delivering an intervention option versus another option at a given decision point beneficial in promoting a desired proximal outcome? This is the most basic question one should ask, and it is really the foundation of building a Jedi. Like if an app is sending a push notification, again, we need to know that this push notification is actually nudging people to do the things that we want them to do. They can actually change people's near-term behaviors. So this is telling us whether this micro interventions that we are thinking, which is prompting, sending people message, is doing anything at all in the moment. Like we really need to make sure that this thing is doing anything at all before we even think about adapting it. So that's why the first question, although it's not getting at adaptations, is the most basic questions that you will see a lot of MRT studies are based on. Now we can also ask, does the effect of the intervention option change over time? Because it's likely that habituation and boredom eventually cause people to lose interest in the app and lose interest in the message. Maybe in the beginning, people are very engaged, they're interested in what we're telling them, but then after a while, people feel like, okay, I'm just seeing the same message, it's not interesting anymore, then they like dropped out or they tune out. So the goal of detecting this time-varying effect is to know when changes should be made to avoid our intervention losing effectiveness. Like we need to know, does the effect wear out? When does it wear out? Like that would give us information of thinking like, how are we going to optimize this app? Like when are we want to make the change? Another interesting question to ask, like of course, why this is like really the core of adaptive intervention is that what is the best time and context to deliver an intervention? So the answer to these questions drive the adaptations. Now, by identifying the moments or the context where the micro-interventions works the best, this ultimately becomes the decision root of the Jedi. Okay, let's look at a real MRT example. So this is a study led by researchers at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. The reference is at the bottom of the slide. So Drink Less is a behavioral change app that aims to help higher risk drinker in the UK adult population to reduce their alcohol consumption. This study recruited adults who self-reported to have excessive alcohol consumptions. This app is building around the theory, the behavioral change mechanism, that self-monitoring is a useful tool for helping people reduce drinking. Because by self-monitoring, people increase awareness of their own behavior, and then that ultimately leads to reduced drinking. But the problems the researchers were facing was that low engagement with the app limits the behavioral change. And so one feature of this Drink Less app is that it sends push notifications to remind people of completing self-monitoring. The knowledge gap they're facing is that do push notifications actually encourage engagement with the app? Like they don't have solid causal evidence to support that we should send people push notifications because that is going to lead them to using the app. They actually didn't know that. And so they designed an MRT to answer that questions. So their primary questions is very straightforward. Does sending a notification increase engagement with the app compared to not sending a notification? And they ask 3 secondary questions. The first secondary question is which notification type among the 2 evaluated is more effective? We will see more about that in the next slides when we talk about the actual study design. Another secondary question they ask is how does the intervention effect change over time? The third question they ask is the intervention effect moderated by habituations? Right? So the idea is that if people receive push notifications very frequently in close cessation, does that make the push notification less effective? This is how the study was designed. It was a 30-day MRT. Now, each day at 8 p.m., people were randomized into one of the 3 options. They either got no notification, or they got a standard notification that says, please complete your mood and drinking diary. Or they got a notification that was randomly selected from a message bank. So the message can read something like, recording if then plans can help you drink less. Or something like, setting a doable goal can help you drink less. Take a moment to set a doable goal. So 3 arms, 3 conditions: no notifications, standard notifications, a random notification. The proximal outcome is engagement with the app. This is operationalized as whether someone opened the app between 8 to 9 p.m., so the hours immediately following this randomization. So this is a very interesting operationalization of the proximal outcome, and I really want to draw your attention to that because it is not asking whether someone have completed the diary. It is actually asking whether someone has opened the app. It is the most immediate behavioral consequence associated with this push notification. And then they use that as the proximal outcome to really getting at, is this push notification doing anything at all? Since this is a 30-day MRT, this entire procedure that we're talking about were just repeated every day at 8 p.m. So it repeated a total of 30 times. So for each participant, they were randomized into one of the 3 conditions for 30 times. Now, to understand how this MRT was structured, we can look at the key components the researcher defined. The distal outcome of the intervention under development is that participants would reduce their excessive drinking. So this is like the ultimate goal of this entire intervention. The proximal outcome is that participants open the app every day in the hour between 8 to 9. So this is the immediate behavior that push notifications are intended to influence. And this is a behavior that is laying on the causal pathway between why are we sending push notifications and then like how is it influencing the ultimate long-term goal. It's like in the middle on the causal pathway. The intervention options tested here are notifications versus no notifications. And for notification, it is further split into standard notification versus randomly selected notifications. The decision point is 8 p.m. each day for 30 days. So each evening at 8 p.m. represents a new opportunities where we can learn about whether this push notification we're sending is doing anything at all. Okay, Now I want to zoom out these very specific examples and then talk more generally about the considerations that involved in designing MRTs. The first question that we should ask is, taking a step back, is there a need for sequential randomization at all? Trials with sequential randomizations are intended to inform the sequencing and adaptations of intervention options. They should be motivated by scientific questions that concerns which intervention option to deliver and under what conditions at more than one decision point. So that is to say that we turn to MRT when we actually need these repeated randomizations to tell us how to make the micro intervention decisions at many decision points. Like MRTs are intended to optimize these JEDIs that we want to design. So if our questions is really about how this JEDI as a package is useful or not, and then we don't have the question of like looking under the hood, trying to decide how to do at every single micro intervention, then we probably do not need an MRT at all. So the two pictures here are the examples that are very commonly used by the group. Is that we should think of MRT as like looking inside a car. Like we're trying to really tweak this car to figure out how can we make this car better. And it's not supposed to be an evaluation tool, which is on the left-hand side when we're putting two cars side by side. That would be an evaluation. Like we have already designed our car, the car is good to go, and then now we're trying to see, okay, is this car faster than the other car? Like that is not the goal of MRT. Like the goal of MRT is not to do evaluation. It is to do optimization. So the type of question we ask and then the perspective we take is very different. Like it would even down the road, right? We're not talking about sample size, but even down the road, it would influence things like sample size design, because we are not trying to come up with the most conclusive finding that we would generalize. We're really trying to generate insight to figure out how can we make this JEDI better. So that would mean that when we're powering an MRT, we're trying to determine the sample size is more lenient. And it is okay that we're not finding this effect at 0.5 significance level. It's okay because we are generating more research questions that we want to test in the future research. Another question that we think about when designing MRT is that what should be the time scale of randomizations? In the drink less example, the randomization occurred every day at 8 p.m. So some other MRTs may have even more frequent randomizations. Like we can randomize people, like there is a study where they randomize people like 6 times per day, every 2 hours within a single day. So how do we decide what is the time scale of this MRT? The key idea is that the time scale of this MRT randomization should correspond to the time scale of the JEDI that we're trying to develop. So how fast can we adapt this intervention in a way that is useful, that is practical, that makes sense? So to do that, like we need to at least make 3 considerations here. So first is that we need to decide how long it would take the intervention options to produce the anticipated benefit and how long these benefits are anticipated to last. If the effect is short-lived, like we expect that the effect of this push notification would dissipate after 1 hour or 10 minutes, then that makes sense to consider adapting the interventions more quickly. But if the intervention is something that takes time to unfold, like people need a couple of days to figure it out, and once they do it, they take like some time to like recover from that cognitive energy, then we probably don't want to make the decision overly quickly. We also need to consider what we're asking of participants, because like when we're making an adaptation to the interventions, like we need to measure the participant in some way. If this measurement is passive, if the measurement is done through like a smartwatch or digital device, then maybe it is okay that we make this adaptation very quickly because it doesn't require a lot of active effort from the participant. But if this adaptation is based on self-report, then that's a completely different story. Like we cannot expect a person to self-report their status. Like we cannot realistically expect a person to report their status very quickly. Like we can't expect someone to tell us whether they're stressed every hour. So in that case, if we are relying these adaptations on people's self-report, then it probably doesn't make sense to do it too quickly because it can't be something that rolls out in practice. And also when we're thinking about what we're asking of participants, it's not just the time and the effort we're asking participants. Sometimes it's also the emotional load. So I heard about this from a reviewer that I was trying to, we were describing an examples about increasing exercise. And then the reviewer was saying that, well, you need to think about what it means when you ask someone to report doing that every day. Because if someone doesn't do well, they may feel bad about it. And then when we ask, yes, it is true that we ask people one question, did you do exercise or not? But if this is a question that triggers negative emotions, it can backfire. Sometimes it's not the more question, the better, right? It's really thinking about from the recipient's perspective, what is the best way that this intervention ultimately will benefit them. So of course, one more thing we need to think about is the other side. What are the resources needed to deliver and adapt these interventions? In this context, we are talking about digital interventions. So we would assume that there is not much effort involved in delivering the intervention because, well, we just program the app to do it one way or the other. But sometimes the adaptation, the intervention involve human support. It could be that we are asking a coach to call this person to touch base and then set a plan for the next day. And once we have human involved in the intervention, then making adaptations would be a lot more expensive, much more costly, because coach needs time to plan. We can't just switch the coach on and off, saying that, okay, in 1 hour you call, and then people need to plan. One more thing that we need to consider is, should randomization be restricted? So this is a concept that I haven't talked about. It is a concept that you have seen in Libby's talk, in the prototypical SMART, the second stage randomization is restricted to the slow responders. A similar concept applies here to MRT. The micro-randomizations across all the decision points can be restricted to specific subgroups. We don't have to involve everyone at every single randomizations. And we make that decisions based on our existing knowledge of what type of interventions would make sense for the person at the moment. Now let's revisit this drink less study as an example. So this study did not have restrictions. So every day at 8 p.m., they randomize all their participants to one of the 3 conditions. People get no prompt, one prompt saying one standard prompt, or a randomly selected prompt. So no restriction in this example. But we can imagine a scenario where we might want to restrict this randomization. Because we probably don't want to send people message. We don't want to send people reminders if people have already completed this daily survey. Why are we, not daily survey, daily diary. We don't want to remind them to do it if they have done it. Because our reminder would just be very redundant. It can be annoying. So in that case, right, we already make this decision. If people have completed their daily diary, no prompt. If people have not completed their daily diary, question mark, do we want to send or not? Or does sending doing anything? So that would mean that we want to build a yes-no check before each randomization, right at the moment of 8 p.m. We do a quick check, right? Does this person complete it? Yes, go straight to no notifications. No, then we send this person down the randomization path. So restrictions in MRTs are essentially a way to incorporate existing knowledge we have into the trial design. Like we have made some decisions about how an adaptation or how like a Jedi should look like, that it would be efficient to incorporate those information into our trial design. Like an MRT can be restricted to different degree. Generally, the more restrictions we impose, the less information the trial generate. But then it's also like the more focused the scenarios that we're testing. So that is like a trade-off that we really need to consider when we're designing an MRT. So that is covered the basis of what is an MRT, what is a Jedi's, all the concepts. Now I move on to get a little bit more statistical and talk about analysis using MRT data. Again, using drinkless as the illustrative example. The primary question is, does sending a notification increase engagement with the app compared to not sending a notification? So their primary questions does not differentiate between the two types of notification. They just want to know what's the effect of notification. So that's like a simplified version of their trial design, where I collapse the two arms into one arm, notification. Oh, no. I should say that at the very intuitive level, what it means to do an analysis with MRT data is that we estimate the causal effect of notification at each single decision point. And then we just average that micro causal effect across all the decision points. So that's what MRT analysis is at the very, very high level, intuitive level. But let's get a little bit more formal in that definition, be a little bit more precise. Let's suppose that we use I to indicate each participant, each individual, and that we use T to indicate each decision point. There are three critical variables in analysis. The first is IIT. Okay, here, IIT. So IIT is an eligibility indicator. It's indicating whether this person is eligible for randomization or not. So this is getting back at the concept of restricting randomizations that we were talking about, right? So we're saying that the micro-randomizations were at each decision point are restricted only to those who are eligible for randomizations. So this IIT is an indicator for that. AIT is the intervention assignment indicator. So AIT equal to 1 if someone got the notification, and AIT equal to 0 if someone did not get the notification. And YIT is the proximal outcome. So I want to say that I'm considering the simplest, but also the most common scenario where IIT is measured immediately after the current randomization. So it's really getting at the effect of this particular randomization. Like if the YIT, which is our outcome, is measured later after the second randomization has occurred, then the analysis becomes a lot more complicated, and we're not getting to that. So if we were to map these three critical variables into the drinkless example, IIT is something that measured immediately before randomization, yes, no check. AIT is an indicator of someone get notification or no notification. And YIT is the outcome. Did someone open the app or not? The estimate that quantifies the causal effect of MRT analysis is called the marginal excursion effect. So this is an effect that is defined using potential outcome notations at each decision point. So I want to emphasize this phrase at each decision point because this effect is isolating the causal effect of this micro intervention at this specific decision point that we're talking about. So it's a concept that is not defined at the study level, like by definition is defined at like decision point level. Now, if the outcome is continuous, that is how the effect is defined. It looks a little bit complex, so let's unpack that. Now, first, I want to talk about this A bar term. So this A bar term indicates the history of the intervention. So it's the history, like, because micro-randomized, like MRT has so many randomization, right? So at a specific time t, A bar is indicating what is this person's intervention history up to time t minus 1. Like, why are we having like a history term here for like the definition of a causal effect at time t? So to make that a little bit concrete, right? That's because the person's state at time t is determined by this person's history, and that we fully acknowledge that. Like, suppose an app is sending message at a very high frequency, and then this participant may feel very annoyed, and this participant would just like drop out of the study, deleted the app. Like, if that happened, then this person is definitely not eligible for randomization anymore. So this term here that is highlighted in purple is capturing that. It is saying that IIT, which is whether a person is eligible for randomization, equal to 1 would mean that, okay, this person is eligible for randomization at time t. So this condition is a function of this person's history. Like, how this person is intervened in the past have a direct influence on whether this person is eligible for randomization at this moment. And then the definition is acknowledging that. Now, we can make a similar argument about the person's proximal outcome. Like, a person's eligibility is influenced by the history, and of course, their proximal outcome should be influenced by the history. So the term that is highlighted here is representing the person's proximal outcome at time t, given this intervention history up to time t minus 1, and then they are intervened at time t. So this 1 here, like we have YIT, parenthesis, A bar, 1. This 1 here is indicating that this person is intervened at time t. And the term next to it, which almost looks similar, except that instead of 1, we have 0, that is indicating this person's potential outcome given the same intervention history, but then received no intervention at time t. So like the only difference between these two, so these two terms both have an A bar term to say that the current outcome is influenced by the history. And then we have 1 to indicate that someone is intervened at this particular time point, and then we have 0 to say that this person is not intervened at this particular time point. Now, when we're subtracting them, what we're capturing is a momentary contrast between providing versus withholding intervention at this particular point in time. So there are two things to note about this calculation, right? First is that this is a conditional, like there is like a condition here, because we're conditional this causal effect estimation on people who are eligible for randomization at that point in time. That makes intuitive sense, right? Like, we should only calculate the causal effect using the cases that are included in the randomizations. Another thing to note is that this is an effect that is marginalizing over the stochastic prior intervention history, indicated by the A bar term that I was talking about. So we are completely acknowledging that the sequential randomizations in MRT is generating many different history, and that we're just like averaging over that. So this is why this estimate is called a causal excursion effect, because this estimation at time t has generated a very brief what-if contrast. So at this specific moment, people are sent on like sent on a brief excursion into one of the two alternative conditions. And then by doing these calculations, we are capturing this momentary contrast between the two alternative conditions. So all of that is about how marginal excursion effect is a concept that is defined at the decision point level. But in practice, right, we are actually not interested in calculating an effect at each decision point. Like if there are 30 decision points, like we don't want 30 separate causal excursion effect. So what is common in practice is that we actually want to estimate an average MEE across all the decision points. So what does that mean, right? How can we think about that very simply in an outcome model? So here I give a very simple regression as an intuition to show how an average MEE can manifest in a generative model for the outcome. It's like really the simplest form of like regression. The y here is the proximal outcome, and then the proximal outcome is a function of the intervention assignment at that particular point in time. And here, the beta zeroed represent the causal excursion effect at all t. Caveats. I'm not trying to say that this is the model that we actually use to do the estimation. So the estimation is a lot more complicated. Like the actual estimation procedure is more complicated than this. Like, first of all, we definitely include a bunch of covariates to absorb the error variance in the error. We also, actually, the estimation is a semi-parametric procedure. Like it doesn't require the outcome model to be correctly specified. It only required the marginal excursion effect. So it only required the parametric form of the, like this beta here to be correctly specified. And also there is things that we can use ways to account for time varying randomization probability. That's something that Walter will get to. And also we would center, we would also center the intervention assignment. So yeah, those technical details are like not important here. I'm just really saying that to emphasize this is not the estimation model. This should be a conceptual model and intuition of like how we can think of the MRT analysis very simply at the high level. So far, what we have talked about is what the estimate looks like if the outcome is continuous. But in many cases, the proximal outcome is actually binary, right? So that was the case in drink less, like the person opened the app or not. So we have a binary outcome. So in case we have a binary outcome, this is how we would define the marginal excursion effect at time t. The marginal excursion effect is defined as the logarithm of relative risk. The ratio that is framed is the relative risk. The numerator of the ratio is the probability of the outcome being 1 if treated. And then the numerator is the probability of outcome being 1 if treated, and the denominator is the probability of the outcome being 1 if not treated. So relative risk is a concept that's like, should be quite intuitive and easy to understand. And here is how the outcome model would look like if we're interested in estimating an MEE across the entire study. Like we're interested in estimating an average MEE. Like essentially we would have like a very simple model. The logarithm of the probability of outcome being 1 is a direct function of the intervention assignment. Again, emphasizing that not the actual model we use for doing estimation. This is really only intended to illustrate the intuition behind it. And just in case you're curious, since I was curious, like why it was not a logistic regression model. Could be a logistic regression model, right? But it's not a logistic regression model because one, the relative risk is a concept that is easier to understand than odds ratio. Second, relative risk is a collapsible measure, a collapsible quantity. Like if male and female have the same relative risk, we can combine them, the population still have the same relative risk. Like that's what we mean by collapsible. But odds ratio is not a collapsible concept. So this is like a easier to deal with construct when we try to separate people into different groups, which is what adaptive interventions is doing. So what the data set should look like? So the data set should be structured into a long data set. If we have 349 participants, and then the study contained 30 days, 30 decision points, then that should translate into 10,470 rows, long data set. Here is how the data set would look like. The first row is participant ID. We need that row there because when we're actually doing analysis, we need to tell the algorithm which decision points correspond to the same person. That's how we can get the correct confidence interval. And then we have decision points running from 1 to 30. Eligibility indicator. In this case, because drink less did not restrict randomizations, everyone got 1. We have intervention assignments, proximal outcome, randomization probability. So drink less used a fixed randomization probability. They randomized people into interventions with 0.6 and no intervention with 0.4. So we will see it's 0.6 or 0.4, depending on whether people intervened or not intervened at that specific moment. And of course, we also have a bunch of other time-varying variables or baseline covariates. We would use an R package to do MRT analysis. Our package is called MRT analysis. Very intuitive, very user-friendly for people, or for anyone who is familiar with doing regression using R. If the outcome is continuous, we call a function called WCLS. And if the outcome is binary, then we call a function called EMEE. So here is what the code will look like for addressing the primary aim analysis. Again, just a reminder, the primary aim analysis, which is what we're trying to address here, is thus sending a push notification to increase people's probability of opening the app. Here we would input the data set name. The ID here is participant ID. Outcome takes in the proximal outcome. Treatment takes in the intervention indicator. Rand prob takes in the randomization probabilities. This is, do we have a moderator for the intervention effect? In this case, let's say it's no. And do we have control variables? For simplicity, let's say it's no. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about this availability parameter. So the availability parameter is really the eligibility. There's a lot of controversial debates on what are we calling it. Initially, it was called availability because we're talking about whether people are available for the randomizations. But then I think we're increasingly moving to the term eligibility. That's why I have really used the word eligibility throughout this entire talk. But the R package used the term availability. Here is what the results would look like. I want to say that the results by definition, or no, by default, does not output the coefficients of control variables. Like in the code that I just showed you, I included no control variables, so that's not an issue. But even if we did include control variables, the default is that it does not output a coefficient for those control variables. And the reason is that we are not supposed to interpret those coefficients. Like the estimation is like a semi-parametric procedure. It does not rely on all those control variables to be correctly specified to generate a robust estimation of the marginal excursion effect. And then we also do not assume that these models are correctly specified. So anyways, it's a technical detail. I just want to say that if you don't see the control variable coefficients, that's just what it's supposed to be. This effect is extremely significant. The estimate we see here is 1.246937. So what does that mean? So this estimation is the marginal excursion effect. Like if we remember that in the case when the outcome is binary, marginal excursion effect is defined as the logarithm of the relative risk. So that means that the logarithm of the relative risk equal to 1.246937. And if we were to take the exponential of both sides, we see that the relative risk is actually 3.5. That means that participants were 3.5 times more likely to open the app when they were delivered the notifications compared to then when they weren't. So that is like it's like gigantic, like that. It's like I can't believe that. That's like a gigantic effect that they're seeing there. So like when I was playing with the sample size calculator, in fact, the maximum that the Shiny app allowed was 3. So they detected a fact that is like over the maximum that people would typically assume. Anyways, yeah, I just find that's really interesting. Good for them. The primary result have established that sending a push notification is effective at nudging people to open the app, right? So once we know that this intervention works on general, the very natural next question is to ask, does this intervention effect change over time? Does it at some point wears out because people just get bored to the notification? So one way to operationalize that is to operationalize the MEE as a function of time. Like in this case, it's operationalized as like a linear function. So if we were to, like, how does that manifest in the outcome models? It's really very simple. Like it would mean that we're including time as a moderator. Like we want to know whether the intervention effect is moderated by a function of time. It's moderated by time. Now, one caveat, small one, is that we need to think carefully about what it means. Like, what does time mean? It's like in the MRT study, there were so many different constructs of time. Like, are we saying that we think this intervention effect is changing from decision point to decision point? Or do we think that this intervention effect changed from day to day or from week to week? Like, what does it mean? Like, how do we operationalize this time variable here? It's just something that is worth thinking about. Here is the code for doing that analysis. Everything else is the same as doing the primary aim analysis. The only difference is that now we include time as a moderator. Day since down low, that's the moderator. And here is the effect. So we have two estimates. The first estimate here is the intercept. The second is, so one is beta 0, the other is beta 1. That's how they correspond to the marginal excursion effect. So we see that the time effect is not significant. So there is no evidence that this effect wears out as a function of time. Which is a good thing. Like in this case, like we probably don't want, like hopefully we don't see that this effect wears out. Like the fact that it's not significant is a good thing. Another interesting question to ask is whether the intervention effect is moderated by habituation. Now here, habituation is operationalized as a simple binary indicator. Did participant received the notification the day before, yes or no? So the rationale is that if someone received the notification yesterday, they might have already gotten used to this message. Then this message that I get today is less effective than it would be if people have not received the message yesterday. So again, it's operationalizes through an interaction term. We're testing whether habituation, a yes-no binary indicator, is moderating our interaction effect. So here is how it would, like at the bottom of the slide, is how it would manifest in the outcome model. So here's the slide for that. Here's the code for doing that. We're including habituation as a moderator, just the same as how time was. The result is that it's not significant. So there was no evidence that the intervention effect is moderated by whether someone received the notification the day before. So at least in this study, right, we don't see strong evidence that people are bored by consecutive notification to the extent that notification is no longer useful. So we don't have the time to go into details of the sample size calculator, but I do want to say that there are two versions of sample size calculator. One version is a Shiny app very easy to use, a website. You go in and then you just plug in all the input parameters, and then it gives you a result sample size right away. The R package is a slightly more flexible version than the R Shiny app. Underlying idea is the same, but R package is more flexible, that you can put in the parameters a little bit more. Like if the study is the MRT that you are designing is very complex, then it would make sense to use the R package. Here is the additional resources. Here's the additional resources that goes to the D3C website, where they have all the code examples. It's like the same as what Libby has showed you. I think I want to end my talk with a takeaway that I want to pull it back to this Miss S that I started in the beginning of this talk. So like ultimately, like all the experimental design, like all the statistics, like everything we talk about should link back to like the problem. Like who is the person that we're trying to help? No, not person. What kind of people we're trying to help? And then what is the problem? And then from there, we start with a conceptual model. Like what is ultimately the outcome we try to improve? From there, we identified the causal pathway, and then we identified the intervention options that we think would influence this causal pathway. And it's only when we have this conceptual model, like we start to think about what is the timescale of the randomizations, where are the open scientific questions that we want to address, like how do we design these trials so that we can inform these interventions that would like ultimately be useful, be practical, and then be resource efficient. Yeah. So with that, these are the key references. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.